Chapter 26 of the Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. John Bull's Great Money Humbug, The South Sea Bubble in 1720. Chapter 26. The South Sea Bubble is one of the most startling lessons which history gives us of the ease with which the most monstrous and absurd and wicked humbugs can be crammed down the throat of poor human nature. It ought also to be a useful warning of the folly of mere speculation as compared with real business undertakings. The history of the South Sea Bubble has been told before, but it is too prominent a case to be entirely passed over. It occupied a period of about 8 months, from February 1st, 1720, to the end of the following September. It was an unreasonable expansion of the value of the stock in the South Sea Company. This company was formed in 1711. Its stock was, at first, about $30 million, subscribed by the public and handed over by the corporators to government to meet certain troublesome public debts. In return, government guaranteed the stockholders a dividend of 6%, and gave the company sundry permanent important duties and a monopoly of all trade to the South Pacific, or South Sea. This matter went on with fair success as a money enterprise until the birth of the bubble, which was as follows. In the end of January 1720, probably in consequence of catching infection from "Law's Mississippi scheme" in France, the South Sea Company and the Bank of England made competing propositions to the English government to repeat the original South Sea Company financiering plan on a larger scale. The proposition of the company, which was accepted by government, was to assume as before the whole public debt, now amounting to over $150 millions, and to be guaranteed at first a 5% dividend and afterward a 4% one to the stockholders by government. For this privilege the company agreed to pay outright a bonus of more than $17 million. This plan is said to have been originated and principally carried through by Sir John Blunt, one of the company's directors. Parliament adopted it after 2 months' discussion, the bubble having, however, been swelling monstrously all the time. It must be remembered that the wonderful profits expected from the company were to come from their monopoly of South Sea trade. Tremendous stories were told by Blunt and his friends, who could have hardly believed more than half of their own talk, about a free trade with all the Spanish Pacific colonies, the importation of silver and gold from Peru and Mexico in return for dry goods, etc., etc., all which fine things were going to produce 2 or 3 times the amount of the company's stock every year. When the bill authorizing the arrangement passed, South Sea stock had already reached a price of 400%. The bill was stoutly opposed in Parliament by Mr. (afterwards Sir) Robert Walpole, and a few others, but in vain. Under the operation of the beautiful stories of the speculative Blunt and his friends, South Sea stock, after a short lull in April, began to rise again, and the bubble swelled and swelled in size so monstrous, and with colors so gay, that it filled the whole horizon of poor foolish John Bull, perfectly turned his bull-headed brain, and made him for the time absolutely crazy. The directors opened books on April 12th for £5,000,000 of new stock, charging, however, £300 for each share of £100, or 300% to begin with. Double the amount was subscribed in a few days, That is, John Bull subscribed $30 million for 10 millions of stock, where only 5 millions were to be had. In a few days more, these subscribers were selling at double what they had paid. April 21st, a 10% dividend was voted for midsummer. In a day or two, another 5 million subscription was opened at 400% to begin with. The whole, and half as much more, was taken in a few hours. In the end of May, South Sea stock was worth 500 to 1. On the 28th, it was 550. In 4 days more, for some reason or another, it jumped to 890. The speculating Blunt kept all this time blowing and blowing at his bubble. All summer he and his friends blew and blew, and all summer the bubble swelled and floated and shone, and high and low, men and women, lords and ladies, clergymen, princesses and duchesses, merchants, gamblers, tradesmen, dressmakers, footmen, bought and sold. In the beginning of August, South Sea stock stood at 1,000%. It was really worth about 25%. The crowding in Exchange Alley, the Wall Street of the day, was tremendous. So noisy and unmanageable and excited was this mob of greedy fools that the very same stock was sometimes selling 10% higher at one end of the alley than at the other. The growth of this monstrous, noxious bubble hatched out a multitude of young cockatrices. Not only was the stock of the India Company, the Bank of England, and other sound concerns much increased in price by sympathy with this fury of speculation, but a great number of utterly ridiculous schemes and barefaced swindles were advertised and successfully imposed on the public. Any piece of paper purporting to be stock could be sold for money. Not the least thought of investigating the solvency of advertisers seems to have occurred to anybody. Nor was any rank free from the poison. Almost 100 projects were before the public at once, some of them incredibly brazen humbugs. There were schemes for a wheel for perpetual motion, capital $5 million, for trading in hair, for wigs, in those days, "a big thing," for furnishing funerals to any part of Britain, for improving the art of making soap, for importing walnut trees from Virginia, capital $10 million, for insuring against losses by servants, capital $15 million, for making quicksilver malleable, Puckle's Machine Company, for discharging cannonballs and bullets, both round and square, and so on. One colossal genius in humbugging actually advertised in these words, "A company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is." The capital he called for was $2,500,000 in shares of $500 each, deposit on subscribing $10 per share. Each subscriber was promised $500 per share per annum, and full particulars were to be given in a month, when the rest of the subscription was to be paid. This great financier, having put forth his prospectus, opened his office in Cornhill the next morning at 9 o'clock. Crowds pressed upon him. At 3 p.m. John Bull had paid this immense humbug, $10,000 being deposits on 1,000 shares subscribed for. That night the financier, a shrewd man, modestly retired to an unknown place upon the continent, and was never heard of again. Another humbug, almost as preposterous, was that of the "globe permits." These were square pieces of playing cards, with a seal on them having the picture of the Globe Tavern, and with the words "sailcloth permits." What they "permitted" was a subscription at some future period to a sailcloth factory, projected by a certain capitalist. These permits sold at one time for $300 each. But the more sensible members of government soon exerted their influence against these lesser and more palpable humbugs. Some accounts say that the South Sea Company itself grew jealous, for it was reckoned that these "side shows" called for a total amount of $1,500,000,000, and itself took legal means against them. At any rate, an order in council was published, peremptorily dismissing and dissolving them all. During August it leaked out that Sir John Blunt and some other "insiders" had sold out their South Sea stock. There was also some charges of unfairness in managing subscriptions. After so long and so intense an excitement, the time for reaction and collapse was come. The price of stock began to fall, in spite of all that the directors could do. September 2nd it was down to 700. A general meeting of the company was held to try to whitewash matters, but in vain. The stock fell. The great humbug had received its death blow. Thousands of families saw beggary staring them in the face, grasping them with its iron hand. The consternation was inexpressible. Out of it a great popular rage began to flame up, just as fires often break out among the prostrate houses of a city ruined by an earthquake. Efforts were meanwhile vainly made to stay the ruin by help from the Bank of England. Bankers and goldsmiths, then often doing a banking business, absconded daily. Business corporations failed. Credit was almost paralyzed. In the end of September the stock fell to 175, 150, 135. Meanwhile, violent riots were feared. South Sea directors could not be seen in the streets without being insulted. The king, then in Hanover, was imperatively sent for home, and had to come. So extensive was the misfortune and wrath of the people, so numerous the public meetings and petitions from all over the kingdom, that Parliament found it necessary to grant the public demand, and to initiate a formal inquiry into the whole enterprise. This was done, and the foolish, swindled, disappointed, angry nation, through this proceeding, vented all the wrath it could upon the persons and estates of the managers and officers of the South Sea Company. They were forbidden to leave the kingdom. Their property was sequestrated. They were placed in custody and examined. Those of them in Parliament were insulted there to their faces, several of them expelled, and most violent charges made against them all. A secret investigating committee was set to rip up the whole affair. Knight, the treasurer, who possessed all the dangerous secrets of the concern, ran away to Calais and the Continent, and so escaped. The books were found to have been either destroyed, secreted, or mutilated and garbled. Stock bribes of $250,000, $150,000, $50,000 had been paid to the Earl of Sunderland, the Duchess of Kendal, the king's favorite, Mr. Craggs, one of the secretaries of state, and others. Mr. Aislabie, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, had accumulated $4,250,000 and more out of the business. Many other noblemen, gentlemen, and reputable merchants were disgracefully involved. The trials that were had resulted in the imprisonment, expulsion, or degradation of Aislabie, Craggs, Sir George Caswell, a banker and member of the House, and others. Blunt, a Mr. Stanhope, and a number more of the chief criminals were stripped of their wealth, amounting to from $135,000 to $1.2 million each, and the proceeds used for the partial relief of the ruined, except amounts left to the culprits to begin the world anew. Blunt, the chief of all the swindlers, was stripped of about $925,000, and allowed only $5,000. By this means, and by the use of such actual property as the company did possess, about one-third of the money lost by its means was ultimately paid to the losers. It was a long time, however, before the tone of public credit was thoroughly restored. The history of the South Sea Bubble should always stand as a beacon to warn us that reckless speculation is the bane of commerce, and that the only sure method of gaining a fortune, and certainly of enjoying it, is to diligently prosecute some legitimate calling, which, like the quality of mercy, is "twice blessed." Every man's occupation should be beneficial to his fellow man, as well as profitable to himself. All else is vanity and folly. End of chapter 26. The Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Dodge. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 27. Business Humbugs. John Law. The Mississippi Scheme. Johnny Crapaud as greedy as Johnny Bull. In the "good old times," people were just as eager after money as they are now, and a great deal more vulgar, unscrupulous, and foolish in their endeavors to get it. During about 200 years after the discovery of America, that continent was a constant source of great and little money humbugs. The Spaniards and the Portuguese and French and English all insisted upon thinking that America was chiefly made of gold, perhaps believing, as the man said about Colorado, that the hardship of the place was, you have to dig through 3 or 4 feet of solid silver before the gold could be reached. This curious delusion is shown by the fact that the early charters of lands in America so uniformly reserved to the king his proportion of all gold and silver that should be found. And if gold were not to be had, these lazy Europeans were equally crazy about the rich merchandise which they made sure of finding in the vast and solitary American mountains and forests. In a previous letter I have shown how one of those delusions about the unbounded wealth to be obtained from the countries on the South Sea caused the English South Sea Bubble. A similar belief, at the same time, in the neighboring country of France, formed the airy basis of a similar business humbug, even more gigantic, noxious, and destructive. This was John Law's Mississippi Scheme, of which I shall give an account in this chapter. It was, I think, the greatest business humbug of history. Law was a Scotchman, shrewd and able, a really good financier for those days, but vicious, a gambler, unprincipled, and liable to wild schemes. He had possessed a good deal of property, and had traveled and gambled all over Europe, was witty, entertaining, and capital company, and had become a favorite with the Duke of Orleans and other French nobles. When the Duke became regent of France at the death of Louis XIV in 1715, that country was horribly in debt, and its people in much misery, owing to the costly wars and flaying taxations of the late king. When therefore Law came to Paris with a promising scheme of finance in his hand, the regent was particularly glad to see him, both as financier and as friend. The regent quickly fell in with Law's plans, and in the spring of 1716, the first step, not however so intended at the time, toward the Mississippi Scheme was taken. That was the establishment by royal authority of the banking firm of Law and Company, consisting of Law and his brother. This bank, by judicious organization and issue of paper money, quickly began to help the distressed finances of the kingdom, and to invigorate trade and commerce. This success, which seems to have been an entirely sound and legitimate business success, made one sadly mistaken but very deep impression upon the ignorant and shallow mind of the Regent of France, which was the foundation of all the subsequent trouble. The Regent became firmly convinced that if a certain quantity of bank bills could do so much good, 100,000 times as many bills would surely do 100,000 times as much. That is, he thought printing and issuing the bills was creating money. He paid no regard to the need of providing specie for them on demand, but thought that he had an unlimited money factory in the city of Paris. So far, so good. Next, Law planned, and with the ever-ready consent of the Regent, effected an enlargement of the business of his bank, based on that delusion I spoke of about America. This enlargement was the formation of the Mississippi Company, and this was the contrivance which swelled into so tremendous a humbug. The company was closely connected with the banks, and received, to begin with, the monopoly of all trade to the Mississippi River and all the country west of it. It was expected to obtain vast quantities of gold and silver from that region, and thus to make immense dividends on its stock. At home it was to have the sole charge of collecting all the taxes and coining all the money. Stock was issued to the amount of 100,000 shares at $200, 500 livres each, and Law's help to the government funds was continued by permitting the stock to be paid for in those funds at their par value, though worth in market only about a third of it. Subscriptions came in rapidly, for the French community was far more ignorant about commercial affairs, finances, and the real resources of distant regions than we can easily conceive of nowadays. And not only the Regent, but every man, woman, and child of France, except a very few tough and hard-headed old skeptics, believed every word Law said, and would have believed him if he had told stories 100 times as incredible. Well, pretty soon the Regent gave the associates, the bank and the company, two other monopolies, that of tobacco, always monstrously profitable, and that of refining gold and silver. Pretty soon again he created the bank a state institution by the magnificent name of the Royal Bank of France. Having done this, the Regent could control the bank in spite of law, or order either, for in those days the kings of France were almost perfectly despotic, and the Regent was acting king. I have mentioned the Regent's terrible delusion about paper money. No sooner had he the bank in his power than he added to the reasonable and useful total of the $12 million of notes already out a monstrous issue of $200 million worth in one vast batch, with the firm conviction that he was thus adding so much to the par currency of France. The Parliament of France, a body mostly of lawyers, originating in the Middle Ages, a steady, conservative, wise, and brave assembly, was always hostile to Law and his schemes. When this great expansion of paper currency began, the Parliament made a resolute fight against it, petitioning, ordaining, threatening to hang Law, and frightening him well too. For the thorough enmity of an assembly of old lawyers may well frighten anybody. At last the Regent, by the use of the despotic power of which the kings of France had so much, reduced these old fellows to silence by sticking a few of them in jail. The cross-grained Parliament thus disposed of, everything was quickly made to "look lovely." In the beginning of 1719, more grants were made to Law's associated concerns. The Mississippi Company was granted the monopoly of all trade to the East Indies, China, the South Seas, and all the territories of the French India Company and of the Senegal Company. It took a new and imposing name, "the Company of the Indies." They had already, by the way, also obtained the monopoly of the Canada beaver trade, of this colossal corporation, monopolizing the whole foreign commerce of France, with 2/3 or more of the world, its whole home finances, and other important interests besides. 50,000 new shares were issued, as before, at $100 each. These might be bought, as before, with government securities at par. Law was so bold as to promise annual dividends of $20 per share, which, as the government funds stood, was 120% per annum. Everybody believed him. More than 300,000 applications were made for the new shares. Law was besieged in his house by more than twice as many people as General Grant had to help him take Richmond. The great humbug was at last in full buzz. The street where the wonderful Scotchman lived was busy, filled, crowded, jammed, and choked. Dangerous accidents happened in it every day, from the excessive pressure. From the princes of the blood down to cobblers and lackeys, all men and all women crowded and crowded to subscribe their money, and to pay their money, and to know how many shares they had gotten. Law moved to a roomier street, and the crazy mob crowded harder than ever, so that the chancellor, who held his court of law hard by, could not hear his lawyers. A tremendous uproar, surely, that could drown the voices of those gentlemen. And so he moved again to the great Hotel de Soissons, a vast palace, with a garden of some acres. Fantastic circumstances variegated the wild rush of speculation. The haughtiest of the nobility rented mean rooms near Law's abode to be able to get at him. Rents in his neighborhood rose to 12 and 16 times their usual amount. A cobbler whose lines had fallen in those pleasant places made $40 a day by letting his stall and furnishing writing materials to speculators. Thieves and disreputable characters of all sorts flocked to this concourse. There were riots and quarrels all the time. They often had to send a troop of cavalry to clear the street at night. Gamblers posted themselves with their implements among the speculators, who gambled harder than the gamblers, and took an occasional turn at roulette by way of slackening the excitement, as people go to sleep or go into the country. A hunchback fellow made a good deal of money by letting people write on his back. When Law had moved into the Hotel de Soissons, the former owner, the Prince de Caragon, reserved his gardens, procured an edict confining all stock dealings to that place, put up 500 tents there, leased them at 500 livres a month each, and thus made money at the rate of $50,000 a month. There were just two of the aristocracy who were sensible and resolute enough not to speculate in the stock: the Duc de Saint-Simon and the old Marshal Villars. Law became infinitely the most important person in the kingdom. Great and small, male and female, high and low, haunted his offices and antechambers, hunted him down, plagued his very life out, to get a moment's speech with him, and get him to enter their names as buyers of stock. The highest nobles would wait half a day for the chance. His servants received great sums to announce some visitor's name. Ladies of the highest rank gave him anything he would ask of them for leave to buy stock. One of them made her coachman upset her out of her carriage as Law came by to get a word with him. He helped her up, and she got the word and bought some stock. Another lady ran into the house when he was at dinner, and raised a cry of fire. The rest ran out, but she ran further in to reach Law, who saw what she was at, and like a pecuniary Joseph, ran away as fast as he could. As the frenzy rose toward its height, and the regent took advantage of it to issue stock enough to pay the whole of national debt, namely 300,000 new shares at $1,000 each, or 1,000% in the par value, they were instantly taken. 3 times as many would have been instantly taken. So violent were the changes of the market that the shares rose or fell 20% within a few hours. A servant was sent to sell 250 shares of stock, found on reaching the gardens of the Hôtel de Soissons that since he left his master's house, the price had risen from $1,600, par value 100, remember, to $2,000. The servant sold, gave his master the proceeds at $1,600 a share, and put the remaining $100,000 in his own pocket, and left France that evening. Law's coachman became so rich that he left service and set up his own coach, and when his master asked him to find a successor, he brought 2 candidates and told Law to choose, and he would take the other himself. There were many absurd cases of vulgarians made rich. There were also many robberies and murders. That committed by the Count de Horn, one of the higher nobility, and 2 accomplices, is a famous case. The count, a dissipated rascal, poniarded a broker in a tavern for the money the broker carried with him. But he was taken, and, in spite of the utmost and most determined exertions of the nobility, the regent had him broken on the wheel in public, like any other murderer. The stock of the Company of the Indies, though it dashed up and down 10 and 20% from day to day, was from the first immensely inflated. In August 1719 it sold at 610%. In a few weeks more it arose to 1,200%. All winter it still went up until in April 1720 it stood at 2,050%. That is, one $100 share would sell for $2,050. At this extreme point of inflation, the bubble stood a little, shining splendidly as bubbles do when they are nearest bursting, and then it received 2 or 3 quiet pricks. The Prince de Conti, enraged because Law would not send him some shares on his own terms, sent 3 wagon loads of bills to Law's bank, demanding specie. Law paid it, and complained to the regent, who made him put 2/3 of it back again. A shrewd stock gambler threw specie by small sums until he had about $200,000 in coin, and lest he should be forced to return it, he packed it in a cart, covered it with manure, put on a peasant's disguise, and carted his fortune over the frontiers into Belgium. Some others quietly realized their means in like manner by driblets, and funded them abroad. By such means coin gradually grew very scarce, and signs of a panic appeared. The regent tried to adjust matters by a decree that coin should be 5% less than paper, as much as to say, "It is hereby enacted that there is a great deal more coin than there is." This did not serve, and the regent decreed again that coin should be worth 10% less than paper. Then he decreed that the bank must not pay more than $22 at once in specie, and finally, by a bold stretch of his authority, he issued an edict that no person should have over $100 in coin, on pain of fine and confiscation. These odious laws made a great deal of trouble, spying, and distress, and rapidly aggravated the difficulty they were meant to cure. The price of shares in the great company began to fall steadily and rapidly. Law and the regent began to be universally hated, cursed, and threatened. Various foolish and vain attempts were made to stay the coming ruin by renewing the stories about Louisiana, sending out a lot of conscripted laborers, ordering that all payments must be in paper, and printing a new batch of notes to the amount of another $300 million. Law's two corporations were also doctored in several ways. The distress and fright grew worse. An edict was issued that Law's notes and shares should depreciate gradually by law for a year, and then be worth but half their face. This made such a tumult and outcry that the regent had to retract it in 7 days. On this seventh day, Law's bank stopped paying specie. Law was turned out of his public employments, but still well treated by the regent in private. He was, however, mobbed and stoned in his coach in the street, and had to have a company of Swiss guards in his house, and at last had to flee to the regent's own palace. I have not space to describe in detail the ruin, misery, tumults, loss, and confusion which attended the speedy descent of Law's paper and shares to entire worthlessness. Thousands of families were made paupers, and trade and commerce destroyed by the painful process. Law himself escaped out of France poor, and after another obscure and disreputable career of gambling, died in poverty at Venice in 1729. Thus this enormous business humbug first raised a whole nation into a fool's paradise of imaginary wealth, and then exploded, leaving its projector and many thousands of victims ruined, the country disturbed and distressed, long enduring consequences in vicious and lawless and unsteady habits, contracted while the delusion lasted, and no single benefit, except one most dearly bought lesson of the wicked folly of mere speculation without a real business basis and a real business method. Let not this lesson be lost on the rampant and half-crazed speculators of the present day. Those who buy gold or flour, leather, butter, dry goods, groceries, hardware, or anything else on speculation, when prices are inflated far beyond the ordinary standard, are taking upon themselves great risk, for the bubble must eventually be pricked, and whoever is the holder when that time comes must necessarily be the loser. End of chapter 27.
Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in September 2009. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Part 5. Medicine and Quacks. Chapter 28. Doctors and Imagination, Firing a Joke out of a Cannon, The Paris Eye Water, Magendie on Medical Knowledge, Old Sands of Life. Medical humbugs constitute a very critical subject indeed, because I shall be almost certain to offend some of 3 parties concerned, namely physicians, quacks, and patients. But it will never do to neglect so important a division of my whole theme as this. To begin with, it is necessary to suggest, in the most delicate manner in the world, that there is a small infusion of humbug among the very best of the regular practitioners. These gentlemen, for whose learning, kind-heartedness, self-devotion, and skill I entertain a profound respect, make use of what I may call the gaseous element of their practice, not for the lucre of gain, but in order to enlist the imaginations of their patients in aid of nature and great remedies. The stories are infinite in number which illustrate the force of imagination, ranging through all the grades of mental action, from the lofty visions of good men who dream of seeing heaven opened to them, and all its ineffable glories and delights, down to the low comedy conceit of the fellow who put a smoked herring into the tail of his coat and imagined himself a mermaid. Probably, however, imagination displays its real power more wonderfully in the operations of the mind on the body that holds it than anywhere else. It is true that there are some people even so utterly without imagination that they cannot take a joke. such as that grave man of Scotland, who was at last plainly told by a funny friend quite out of patience, "Why, you wouldn't take a joke if it were fired at you out of a cannon." "Sir," replied the Scot with sound reasoning and grave thought, "Sir, you are absurd. You cannot fire a joke out of a cannon." But to return, it is certainly the case that frequently the doctor takes great care not to let the patient know what is the matter, and even not to let him know what he is swallowing. This is because a good many people, if at a critical point of disease, may be made to turn toward health, if made to believe that they are doing so, but would be frightened, in the literal sense of the words, to death, if told what a dangerous state they are in. One sort of regular practice humbug is rendered necessary by the demands of the patients. This is giving good big doses of something with a horrid smell and taste. There are plenty of people who don't believe the doctor does anything to earn his money, if he does not pour down some dirty brown or black stuff very nasty in flavor. Some, still more exacting, wish for that sort of testimony which depends on internal convulsions, and will not be satisfied unless they suffer torments and expel stuff enough to quiet the inside of Mount Vesuvius or Popocatepetl. "He's a good doctor," was the verdict of one of this class of leather-boweled fellows. "He'll work your innards for you." It is a milder form of this same method to give what the learned faculty term a placebo. This is a thing in the outward form of medicine, but quite harmless in itself. Such is a bread pill, for instance, or a draught of colored water, with a little disagreeable taste in it. These will often keep the patient's imagination headed in the right direction, while good old Dame Nature is quietly mending up the damages in the soul's dark cottage. One might almost fancy that, in proportion as the physician is more skillful, by so much he gives less medicine, and relies more on imagination, nature, and, above all, regimen and nursing. Here is a story in point. There was an old gentleman in Paris, who sold a famous eye water, and made much gain thereby. He died, however, one fine day, and unfortunately forgot to leave the recipe on record. His disconsolate widow continued the business at the old stand, however, to quote another characteristic French anecdote, and being a woman of ready and decisive mind, she very quietly filled the vials with water from the river Seine, and lived respectively on the proceeds, finding, to her great relief, that the eye water was just as good as ever. At last, however, she found herself about to die, and under the stings of an accusing conscience, she confessed her trick to her physician, an eminent member of the profession. "Be entirely easy, madam," said the wise man. "Don't be troubled at all. You are the most innocent physician in the world. You have done nobody any harm. It is an old and illiberal joke to compare medicine to war, on the ground that the votaries of both seek to destroy life. It is, however, not far from the truth to say that they are alike in this, that they are both preeminently liable to mistakes, and that in both he is most successful who makes the fewest. How can it be otherwise until we know more than we do at present of the great mysteries of life and death? It seems risky enough to permit the wisest and most experienced physician to touch those springs of life which God only understands. And it is enough to make the most stupid stare to see how people will let the most disguised quack jangle their very heartstrings with his poisonous messes, about as soon as if he were the best doctor in the world. A true physician, indeed, does not hasten to drug. The great French surgeon Magendie is even said to have commenced his official course of lectures on one occasion by coolly saying to his students, "Gentlemen, the curing of disease is a subject that physicians know nothing about." This was doubtless an extreme way of putting the case. Yet it was in a certain sense exactly true. There is one of the geysers in Iceland into which visitors throw pebbles or turfs, with the invariable result of causing the disgusted gazer in a few minutes to vomit the dose out again, along with a great quantity of hot water, steam, and stuff. Now the doctor does know that some of his doses are pretty sure to work, as the traveler knows that his dose will work on the gazer. It is only the exact how and why that is not understood. But however mysterious is nature, however ignorant the doctor, however imperfect the present state of physical science, The patronage and the success of quacks and quackeries are infinitely more wonderful than those of honest and laborious men of science and their careful experiments. I have come about to the end of my tether for this time, and quackery is something too monstrous in dimensions as well as character to be dealt with in a paragraph. But I may with propriety put one quack at the tail of this letter. It is but just that he should let decent people go before him. I mean old sands of life. Everybody has seen his advertisement beginning, "A retired physician whose sands of life have nearly run out," etc. And everybody, almost, knows how kind the fellow is in sending gratis his recipe. All that is necessary is, as you find out when you get the recipe, to buy at a high price from him one ingredient which, he says, you can get nowhere else. This swindling scamp is in fact a smart brisk fellow of about 35 years of age, notwithstanding the length of time during which, to use a funny phrase which somebody got up for him, he has been afflicted with a loose tailboard to his mortal sand-cart. Some benevolent friend was so much distressed about the feebleness of old sands of life as to send him one day a large parcel by express, marked C.O.D. and costing quite a figure. Old Sands paid, and, opening the parcel, found half a bushel of excellent sand. End of chapter 28. Of The Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Abai in September 2009. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 29. The Consumptive Remedy. E. Andrews, M.D. Born Without Birthrights. Hashish Candy. Roback the Great. A Conjurer Opposed to Lying. There is a fellow in Williamsburg who calls himself a clergyman, and sells a consumptive remedy, by which I suppose he means a remedy for consumption. It is a mere slop corked in a vial, but there are a good many people who are silly enough to buy it of him. A certain gentleman, during last November, earnestly sought an interview with this reverend brother in the interests of humanity, but he was as inaccessible as a chipmunk in a stone fence. The gentleman wrote a polite note to the knave, asking about prices, and received a printed circular in return, stating in an affecting manner the good man's grief at having to raise his price in consequence of the cost of gold, with which I am obliged to buy my medicines, saith he, in Paris. This was both sad and unsatisfactory, and the gentleman went over to Williamsburg to seek an interview and find out all about the prices. He reached the abode of the man of piety, but, strange to relate, he wasn't at home. Gentleman waited. Reverend brother kept on not being at home. When gentleman had waited to his entire satisfaction, he came back. It is understood it is practically out of the question to see the reverend brother. Perhaps he is so modest and shy that he will not encounter the clamorous gratitude which would obstruct his progress through the streets from the millions saved by his consumptive remedy. It is a pity that the reverend man cannot enjoy the still more complete seclusion by which the state of New York testifies its appreciation of unobtrusive and retiring virtues like his, in the salubrious and quiet town of Sing Sing. A quack in an inland city who calls himself E. Andrews, M.D., prints a semi-occasional document in the form of a periodical, of which a copy is lying before me. It is an awful hodgepodge of perfect nonsense and vulgar rascality. He calls it The Good Samaritan and Domestic Physician, and this number is called Volume 20. Only think what a great man we have among us, unless the doctor himself is mistaken. He says, I will here state that I have been favored by nature and providence in gaining access to stores of information that has fell to the lot of but very few persons heretofore during the past history of mankind. Evidently these stores were so vast that the great doctor's brain was stuffed too full to have room left for English grammar. Shortly the doctor thus bursts forth again with some views having their own merits, but not such as concern the healing art very directly. The automaton powers of machinery, there's a new style of machinery, you observe, must be made to work for, instead of as now against mankind. The land of all nations must be made free to actual settlers in limited quantities. No one must be born without his birthright, being born with him. The italics, etc., are the doctor's. What an awful thought is this of being born without any birthright, or, as the doctor leaves us to suppose possible, having one's birthright born first, and dodging about the world like a stray canary bird, while the unhappy and belated owner tries in vain to put salt on its tail and catch it. Well, this wiseacre, after his portentous introduction, fills the rest of his 16 loosely printed double-columned octavo pages with a farrago of the most indescribable character, made up of brags, lies, promises, forged recommendations and letters, boasts of systematic charity, funny scraps of stuff in the form of little disquisitions, advertisements of remedies, hair oils, cosmetics, liquors, groceries, thistle killers, anti-bug mixtures, recipes for soap, ink, honey, and the old Harry only knows what. The fellow gives a list of 71 specific diseases for which his hashish candy is a sure cure, and he adds that it is also a sure cure for all diseases of the liver, brain, throat, stomach, ear, and other internal disorders, also for all long-standing diseases, whatever that means, and for insanity. In this monstrous list are jumbled together the most incongruous troubles, bleeding at the nose and abortions, worms, fits, poisons, and cramps. And the impudent liar quotes General Grant, General Mitchell, the rebel General Lee, General McClellan, and Dr. Mott of this city, all shouting in chorus the praises of the hashish candy. Next comes the Secret of Beauty, a preparation of Turkish roses, then a lot of forged references, and an assertion that the doctor gives to the poor 5,000 pounds of bread every winter, then some fearful denunciations of the regular doctors. But, as the auctioneers say, I can't dwell. I will only add that the real villainy of this fellow only appears here and there, where he advertises the means of ruining innocence, or of indulging with impunity in the foulest vices. He will sell for $3.30 the mystic weird ring. In a chapter of infamous bletherumskite about this ring, he says, "The wearer can drive from or draw to him anyone, and for any purpose whatever." I need not explain what the scoundrel means. He also will sell the professed means of robbery and swindling, saying that he is prepared to show how to remove papers, wills, titles, notes, etc., from one place to another, by invisible means. It is a wonder that the Bank of Commerce can keep any securities in his vaults, of course. But enough of this degraded panderer to crime and folly. He is beneath notice, so far as he himself concerned. I devote the space to him because it is well worth while to understand how base an imposture can draw a steady revenue from a nation boasting so much culture and intelligence as ours. It is also worth considering whether the authorities must not be remiss, who permit such odious deceptions to be constantly perpetrated upon the public. I ought here to give a paragraph to the great C.W. Roebuck, one of whose astrological almanacs is before me. This erudite production is embellished in front with a picture of the doctor and his 6 brothers, for he is the 7th son of a 7th son. The 6 elder brethren, nice enough boys, stand submissively around their gigantic and bearded junior, reaching only to his waist, and gazing up at him with reverence, as the sheaves of Joseph's brethren worshipped his sheaf in his dreams. At the end is a picture of Magnus Roebuck, the grandfather of C.W., a bull-headed, ugly old Dutchman, with a globe and compasses. This picture, by the way, is in fact a cheap likeness of the old discoverers or geographers. Within the book we find Gustavus Roebuck, the father of C.W., for whom is used the cut of Jupiter, or some other heathen god, half naked, astraddle of an eagle, with a hook in one hand and a quadrant in the other, which is very much like the picture by one of the old masters, of Abraham about to offer up Isaac, and taking a long aim at the poor boy with a flintlock horse pistol. Dr. Roebuck is good enough to tell us where his brothers are. One a high officer in the Empire of China, another a Catholic bishop in the city of Rome, and so on. There is also a cut of his sister, whom he cured of consumption. She is represented talking to her bird after the fashion of her country when a maiden is unexpectedly rescued from the jaws of death. Roback cures all sorts of diseases, discovers stolen property, ensures children a marriage, and so on, all by means of conjurations. He also casts nativities and foretells future events, and he shows in full how Bernadotte, Louis Philippe, and Napoleon Bonaparte either did well or would have done well by following his advice. The chief peculiarity of this impostor is that he really avoids direct pandering to vice and crime, and even makes it a specialty to cure drunkenness and, of all things in the world, lying. On this point Roback gives in full the certificate of Mrs. Abigail Morgan, whose daughter Amanda was sorely given to fibbing, in so much that she would rather lie than speak the truth. And the delighted mother certifies that our friend and wizard so changed the nature of the girl that, to the best of our knowledge and belief, she has never spoken anything but the truth since. There is a conjurer, as is a conjurer. What an uproar the incantation of the great Roback would make, if set fairly to work among the politicians, for instance! But, after all, on second thoughts, what a horrible mass of abominations would they lie bare in telling the truth about each other all round! No, it won't do to have the truth coming out in politics at any rate. Away with Roback! I will not give him another word, not a single chance, not even to explain his great power over what he calls fits. End of chapter 29. Of The Humbugs of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Avai in September 2009. The Humbugs of the World by P.T. Barnum. Chapter 30. Monsignore Cristoforo Riccio, or Il Creso, the nostrum vendor of Florence, a model for our quack doctors. Every visitor to Florence during the last 20 years must have noticed on the grand piazza before the ducal palace the strange genius known as Monsignore Creso, or, in plain English, Mr. Croesus. He is so called because of his reputed grand wealth, but his real name is Cristoforo Riccio, which I may again translate as Christopher Risk. Mrs. Browning refers to him in one of her poems, the Casa Guidi Windows, I think, and he has also been the staple of a tale by one of the Trollope brothers. Twice every week he comes into the city in a strange vehicle, drawn by 2 fine Lombardy ponies, and unharnesses them in the very centre of the square. His assistant, a capital vocalist, begins to sing immediately, and the crowd soon collects around the wagon. Then Monsignore takes from the box beneath his seat a splendidly joined human skeleton, which he suspends from a tall rod and hook, and also a number of human skulls. The latter are carefully arranged on an adjustable shelf, and Creso takes his place behind them, while in his rear a perfect chemist's shop of flasks, bottles, and pill-boxes is disclosed. Very soon his singer ceases, and in the purest Tuscan dialect, the very utterance of which is music, the Florentine quack doctor proceeds to address the assemblage. Not being conversant with the Italian, I am only able to give the substance of his harangue, and pronounce indifferently upon the merit of his elocution. I am assured, however, that not only the common people, who are his chief patrons, but numbers of the most intelligent citizens, are always entertained by what he has to say, and certainly his gestures and style of expression seem to betray great excellence of oratory. Having turned the skeleton round and round on its pivot, and minutely explained the various anatomical parts, in order to show his proficiency in the basis of medical science, he next lifts the skulls, one by one, and descants upon their relative perfection, throwing in a shrewd anecdote now and then, as to the life of the original owner of each cranium. One skull, for example, he asserts to have belonged to a lunatic, who wandered for half a lifetime in the Val d'Ema, subsisting precariously upon entirely vegetable food, roots, herbs, and the like. Another is the superior part of a convict, hung in Arezzo for numerous offences. A third is that of a very old man who lived a celibate from his youth up, and by his abstinence and goodness exercised an almost priestly influence upon the Borghese. When, by this miscellaneous lecture, he has both amused and edified his hearers, he ingenuously turns the discourse upon his own life, and finally introduces the subject of the marvellous cures he has effected. The story of his medical preparations alone, their components and method of distillation, is a fine piece of popularized art, and he gives a practical exemplification of his skill and their virtues by calling from the crowd successively a number of invalid people, whom he examines and prescribes for on the spot. Whether these subjects are provided by himself or not, I am unable to decide, but it is very possible that by a long experience Cristoforo, who has no regular diploma, has mastered the simpler elements of materia medica, and does in reality effect cures. I class him among what are popularly known as humbugs, however, for he is a pretender to more wisdom than he possesses. It was to me a strange and suggestive scene, the bald, beak-nosed, coal-eyed charlatan standing in the market-place, so celebrated in history, peering through his gold spectacles at the upturned faces below him, while the bony skeleton at his side swayed in the wind, and the grinning skulls below made grotesque faces, as if laughing at the gullibility of the people. Behind him loomed up the massive Palazzo Vecchio, with its high tower, sharply cut, and set with deep machicolations; to the left the splendid Loggia of Orgagna, filled with rare marbles, and the long picture gallery of the Uffizi, heaped with the rarest art treasures of the world. To his right the giant fountain of Ammanato, throwing jets of pure water, one drop of which outvalues all the nostrums in the world. And in front the post office, built centuries before by Pisan captives. If any of these things moved the imperturbable Creso, he showed no feeling of the sort, but for 3 long hours, 2 days in the week, held his hideous clinic in the open daylight. Seeing the man so often, and interested always in his manner, as much so, indeed, as the peasants or contadini who bought his vials and pill-boxes without stint, I became interested to know the main features of his life, and, by the aid of a friend, got some clues which I think reliable enough to publish. I do so the more willingly because his career is illustrative, after an odd fashion, of contemporary Italian life. He was the son of a small farmer not far from Siena, and grew up in daily contact with wine-dressers and olive-gatherers, living upon the hard Tuscan fare of macaroni and maroon nuts, with a cutlet of lean mutton once a day, and a pint of sour Tuscan wine. Being tolerably well educated for a peasant boy, he imbibed a desire for the profession of an actor, and studied Alfieri closely. Some little notoriety that he gained by recitations led him, in an evil hour, to venture an appearance en grand rôle in Florence, at a third-rate theatre. His father had meanwhile deceased, and left him the property, but to make the début referred to he sold almost his entire inheritance. As may be supposed, his failure was signal. However easy he had found it to amuse the rough, untutored peasantry of his neighbourhood, the test of a large and polished city was beyond his merit. So, poor and abashed, he sank to the lower walks of dramatic art, singing in choruses at the opera, playing minor parts in show-pieces, and all the while feeling the sting of disappointed ambition and half-deserved penury. One day found him, at the beginning of winter, without work, and without a soldo in his pocket. Passing a druggist's shop, he saw a placard asking for men to sell a certain new preparation. The druggist advanced him a small sum for travelling expenses, and he took to peripatetic lectures at once, going into the country and haranguing at all the villages. Here he found his dramatic education available. Though not good enough for an actor, he was sufficiently clever for a nomadic eulogizer of a patent medicine. His vocal abilities were also of service to him in gathering the people together. The great secret of success in anything is to get a hearing. Half the object is gained when the audience is assembled. Well, poor, vagabond, peddling Christopher Risk, selling so much for another party, conceived the idea of becoming his own capitalist. He resolved to prepare a medicine of his own, and, profiting by the assistance of a young medical student, obtained bona fide prescriptions for the commonest maladies. These he had made up in gross, originated labels for them, and concealing the real essences thereof by certain harmless adulterations, began to advertise himself as the discoverer of a panacea. To gain no ill will among the priests, whose influence is paramount with the peasantry, he dexterously threw in a reverent word for them in his nomadic harangues, and now and then made a sounding present to the church. He profited also by the superstitions abroad, and to the skill of Hippocrates added the roguery of Simon Magus. By report he was both a magician and a physician, and the knack that he had of sleight of hand was not the least influential of his virtues. His bodily prowess was as great as his suppleness. One day, at Fiesole, a foreign doctor presumed to challenge Monsignore to a debate, and the offer was accepted. While the two stood together in Cristoforo's wagon, and the intruder was haranguing the people, the quack, without a movement of his face or a twitch of his body, jerked his foot against his rival's leg, and threw him to the ground. He had the effrontery to proclaim the feat as magnetic entirely, accomplished without bodily means, and by virtue of his black art acquirements. An awe fell upon the listeners, and they refused to hear the checkmated disputant further. As soon as Cristoforo began to thrive, he indulged his dramatic taste by purchasing a superb wagon, team, and equipments, and hired a servant. Such a turnout had never been seen in Tuscany since the Medicean days. It gained for him the name of Creso straightway, and, enabling him to travel more rapidly, enlarged his business sphere, and so vastly increased his profits. He arranged regular days and hours for each place in Tuscany, and soon became as widely known as the Grand Duke himself. When it was known that he had bought an old castle at Pontasieve, on the banks of the Arno, his reputation still further increased. He was now so prosperous that he set the faculty at defiance. He proclaimed that they were jealous of his profounder learning, and threatened to expose the banefulness of their systems. At the same time, his talk to the common people began to savour of patronage, and this also enhanced his reputation. It is much better, as a rule, to call attention up to you rather than charity down to you. The shrewd impostor became also more absolute now. It was known that the Grand Duke had once asked him to dine, and that Monsignore had the hardihood to refuse. Indeed, he sympathized too greatly with the aroused Italian spirit of unity and progress to compromise himself with the House of Austria. When at last the revolution came, Cristoforo was one of its best champions in Tuscany. His cantate sang only the march of Garibaldi and the victories of Savoy. His own speeches teemed with the gospel of Italy regenerated, and for a whole month he wasted no time in the sale of his bottigias and pilolas, but threw all his vehement, persuasive, and dramatic eloquence into the popular cause. The end we know. Tuscany is a dukedom no longer, but a component part of a great peninsular kingdom with Florence the Beautiful for its capital. And still before the ducal palace, where the deputies of Italy are to assemble, poor, vain Cristoforo Riccio makes his harangue every Tuesday and Saturday. He is now, or was 4 years ago, upward of 60 years of age, but spirited and athletic as ever, and so rich that it would be superfluous for him to continue his peripatetic career. His life is to me noteworthy, as showing what may be gained by concentrating even humble energies upon a paltry thing. Had Creso persevered as well upon the stage, I do not doubt that he would have made a splendid actor. If he did so well with a mere nostrum, why should he not have gained riches and a less grotesque fame by the sale of a better article? He understood human nature, its credulities and incredulities, its superstitions, tastes, changefulness, and love of display and excitement. He has done no harm, and given as much amusement as he has been paid for. Indeed, I consider him more an ornamental and useful character than otherwise. He has brightened many a traveller's recollections, relieved the tedium of many a weary hour in a foreign city, and, with all his deception, has never severed himself from the popular faith, nor sold out the popular cause. I dare say his death, when it occurs, will cause more sensation and evoke more tears than that of any better physician in Tuscany. End of chapter 30.